want to turn it over to Commissioner Nava to talk about some of their findings and some of his ideas about online democracy. I'd also say this, I guess Pedro's going to talk about 20 minutes or so about this. And if you want to, Pedro, you want to talk about other things the Little Hoover Commission has been looking into, other reports, feel free. And then we'll just open it up to questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Nava. And welcome, by the way.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's always a pleasure to share our work with people who are so passionate about the areas of their endeavor as well. Yeah, I was appointed to the Little Hoover Commission in 2013, and then was chosen to be chair in 2014. And apparently I'm out of the room every time they vote for chair because they keep voting me back in. So it's an honor that I accept and enjoy. I also had the advantage of sitting on the Little Hoover Commission as a member of the Assembly when I was in office. I served as the Assembly representative for the Santa Barbara Ventura area from 2004 to 2010. And I had just mentioned that I felt very fortunate, years before that, because I was able to attend community college, able to attend then the California State University system, and then went to law school at University of California, Davis. But with respect to the Little Hoover Commission and meetings online, we found as Little Hoover that it really was extremely efficient and effective and cost savings for our operation. We have about a third of our budget is normally set aside for travel, and that's for travel for members of the commission, as well as occasionally for witnesses who need to participate and to share their knowledge and information. And we decided that we wanted to take a look at how well the emergency declaration by the governor was working, because he suspended the requirements under Bagley-Keene for the in-person meeting. And those of you that are on boards and commissions know that if you are not going to be participating in person, you then have to publish the location, your location, so that if there are members of the public who want to participate, they can show up. Well, I wasn't particularly enthusiastic about having people share my bedroom, because that's where my office is set up. And there are very few opportunities to be remote where the public can join you. So when the rules were suspended by the governor's order, we, like everybody else, went to the remote and to Zoom meetings. And then we decided, since that looked as though it was going to come to an end because the order was set to expire, we said, maybe we should evaluate how well this is working to see what other people's experiences have been. Now, the remote meeting has been extended to the end of January, and we'll see what the legislature does if they introduce something to extend it longer. But some of the things that we learned as we surveyed boards and commissions throughout the state. So, for example, we requested from the Citizens Redistricting Commission, the State Athletic Commission, the California Commission on Disability Access. If you are a board or a commission, we probably asked you how this was working out for you. And what we found from those who responded, we got a 37% response, which is pretty decent when you're doing a survey, that 34% of the organization said that they actually had more frequent meetings. We found that on the Little Hoover Commission. We would normally meet once a month, except for, I think, probably right around Christmas time, but in July. We would meet once a month, but we have met almost about 22 times in 2001 because the meetings are easier to put together. It's more convenient for the members. And that was reflected by the organizations that responded. 34% of them had more frequent meetings. Now, the other question that comes up when you have these remote meetings is, what about the public? So we had 58% told us that there was a lot more public attendance. 37% told us that there was somewhat more public attendance, and 5% said there was no change. So what we learned was that there were more participants, more public participants, when you had the distance meetings that we've all had basically through Zoom. Now, if you are a member of a board or commission, you also want to know, how about the members themselves? How do they work with the Zoom orientation? Well, they found out that 51% of the organizations we polled, they had greater attendance. So board meeting members actually showed up more often when they didn't have to travel to get to the meetings. And now, what about cost savings? Because that's one of the things that I think comes up in discussions about remote meetings. We found that 91% of those polled said it was less expensive to meet remotely. As I mentioned, for the Little Hoover Commission, a third of our budget is travel. We didn't have to spend that during this period of time. Now, so if it was less expensive, the savings to the organizations were anywhere between $10,000 and $50,000 a year. Now, I can hold up the list. It probably won't show very well. But you think of all the boards and commissions that are saving taxpayers, actually, $10,000 to $50,000 a year. That adds up to a significant amount of money when you've got 134 or 150 organizations. We found at the Little Hoover Commission that a great deal of what we need in order to do our work is to have the benefit of expert testimony, people who know more than we do about the subject that we are evaluating. So how did that work? Well, 23% of the organizations told us it was easier to secure witnesses. And I'm sure that you've had similar experiences. You can have people from across the country who, if they are willing to give you their time, will set up a Zoom sort of meeting and offer their testimony. They don't have to get on a plane and fly across the country, or even if they're in California, drive 5 or 6 hours to get to Sacramento. They can do it from the comfort of their office. And we find that it's easier to get witnesses. So did other organizations. Now, we also asked the organizations if they are required to hold future meetings under pre-pandemic requirements. In other words, you had to know if you weren't going to be at the meeting place, you had to identify your physical location. 86% said that they would be less likely to meet remotely. And some of the consequences of not meeting remotely, or actually some of the benefits of meeting remotely, is you actually expand. Not only do you expand the number of people who can participate, but you also find that you get more public participation from people who have limited income. Because if you have to have, just taking Little Hoover, you've got to come to Sacramento for a meeting. That probably means you've got to come the night before. You're going to have to get a hotel room. You're going to have to pay for meals. You're going to have to pay for travel. So if you're lower income, you have a higher likelihood of participating. If you have a different ability, or sometimes disability, it is awkward and uncomfortable, and it's not as easy to travel. So you are likely to have greater participation from members of that community when they don't have to navigate all the obstructions. You know, as enlightened as we are, it is still more difficult for someone to navigate with a physical limitation like a wheelchair than for other people. The additional expansion of participation also means that, and this is a common issue, people who live in rural areas tend to not participate to the same level as those that are in urban areas, where it's just more convenient and it's easier to get around. So taking all things together, we are very supportive of continuing a modification of the Bagley-Keene rules, so that boards and commissions, should they choose, and should certain members choose, can participate remotely without having to disclose the location, so that the public can participate. Now, I did many years ago. I did a meeting from my hometown. I just chose to rent a conference room in a law office and provided the address and the phone number because we had been told that there would be members of the public that wanted to show up, and of course nobody showed up. I don't know that that happens all of the time, but I suspect that often when board members have to disclose under the Bagley-Keene requirements their location, there is in all likelihood not many people who do take advantage of showing up at that location with the commission member, the board member. So I'm not entirely convinced that having to disclose it really does satisfy the idea that more people will participate. So we are encouraging the legislature to extend, however they want to do it, to extend the opportunity for boards and commissions to meet remotely. There's a number of ways that they can do it. They can have a physical location where members of the public can come and participate. The board members, they're not required to meet remotely if they don't want to. You may have some board members who choose to meet remotely and probably won't do it for every meeting because we are all social animals. And I know that on the Little Hoover Commission, many of us miss that opportunity to actually sit and talk with members and just to have that personal exchange with someone. A pat on the back, a hand on someone's shoulder can be really very meaningful and can help change the tone of a conversation if it's not going in the right direction. But we believe, Little Hoover Commission believes that we ought to still have some ability to meet remotely because of the benefits both to the public and to the public process. So I'm happy to attempt to answer any questions you might have about our position on the Bagley-Keene reform.
Pedro, one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and Lynette, I'm going to get you in 1 second. There's two things I wanted to follow up on the report, which I wanted kind of to stress because I read that report, your report, Pedro. I read all of your reports. So one of the things you said, there are two things I thought were really interesting. One was that a lot of times you have experts testify in front of the commission, and they have to drive to Sacramento. It's a big inconvenience. Doing it now virtually, you're getting increase in quantity and quality in the number of experts that are testifying in front of the commission, which results in better decision making. I thought that was a really important point. The second thing was that, Ben, this is particularly important for the Valley, and then this is a good segue to Lynette, Zelezny in Bakersfield. It's difficult for someone in Bakersfield to get to Sacramento to sit on a commissioner board. And one of the things that we've seen, there's been reports that the Valley is underrepresented on state commissions and councils. And one of the reasons probably is because how difficult it is for some Valley folks to get to Sacramento. This also gives the opportunity for folks in Kern County, for example, to be able to sit on these boards and commissions if they can do at least some of the meetings virtually. So with that set up, I'm going to then turn it over to President Zelezny for her question.
Well, thanks so much. Pedro, this has been an outstanding presentation, and I'm so pleased to hear the outcome of the survey. And I think it's particularly meaningful when we think about taxpayers and for those that typically are not participants in democracy. As a social psychologist, so I'm so glad you brought up about being social animals. One of the other things that I've noted, but I haven't seen much research on, but theory would predict that having virtual participation, particularly among those that are introverts, that typically wouldn't voice their opinion, what we're seeing is that introverts are not feeling the environmental pressure of being in a room with many people, and so are much more likely to participate in discussions and conversations of meaning. So it would be a really fascinating research study to see if, as a follow-up to the Little Hoover Commission, if social psychology is predicting it right, that not only is it creating more opportunities for democratic discussion, but those that typically wouldn't be inclined to participate and use their voice are much more inclined.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised by that. When before I became an assembly representative, I was for many years I was a deputy district attorney, and then I was a civil litigator, and so I did a lot of trial work. And I found that I had to invest, if I wanted the results I was looking for, I had to invest a fair amount of time with witnesses, making them feel comfortable in the venue, right? Because how many people ever spend any time in a witness box, sitting next to a judge in front of 12 people they've never seen, and some folks in the audience? So I had to help my witnesses overcome how strange that experience was. And so when you think about Zoom meetings or remote meetings, you're going to be doing it in all likelihood in a place where you're comfortable, some part of your home that you're familiar with. It is not as disruptive to a person's life. If we go back to in-person meetings, I live in Santa Barbara. There's no direct flights from Santa Barbara to Sacramento. So I'll drive to Burbank. That's an hour and a half. Then I need to be there an hour before the flight. So that's 2.5 hours. Then the flight is an hour and 15 minutes. So now we're close to 4 hours. So that half of a workday is taken up with travel and all of the inconvenience that goes along with it. Finding parking, putting your car someplace, dragging your bag where it's supposed to go, and then getting to Sacramento and getting in a cab, getting to your hotel, finding something to eat, and then prep for the meeting the next day, and then do it all again to get home. Now that's a lot to ask of people to do it routinely. And so you understand that in fact what happens on boards and commissions that have those sorts of demands to participate, you're not going to get people who are, for the most part, everyday working folks working for an hourly wage. They can't afford to take the time off. And so you're going to get folks who are older, like me, maybe retired, but work demands are nowhere near what they are going to be like for everyday folks. So if we want representation from parts of the state that don't have enough representation, which I believe then leads to a certain amount of distrust and anxiety with respect to the government. If you can't get up close to government to see how it's working, then you may default to believe that they're not thinking about you, and because they might not be thinking about you. Which is why on another topic, broadband in rural areas is so critically important, not just for government operations, but now we've got telemedicine. We've got to be able to provide services and education to everybody in a way that is fair throughout the state, so that we at least level the field for opportunities. But yeah, I could see how, and I think what we learned in our survey, that remote participation again increases the participation by members on boards and commission, and greatly increases participation by the public.
By the way, Lynette, I've seen that, at least anecdotally. I haven't seen it empirically, but I've seen it anecdotally where people say exactly what you're saying. Gee, I felt constrained in a public meeting, but with this format, it seems easier. So I think you're headed down the right direction, and I'm sure there's already be empirical research on that. Pedro, I want to ask you, so what's going to happen here with the current open meeting laws? It seems to be problematic when it comes to virtual meetings. Is that going to be modified, changed by the legislature to allow for more of this? I mean, what do you see as the future for these online meetings?
Well, I'll tell you what I'm encouraged by. When we first issued a report a few years back, identifying problems with Bagley-Keene and open meetings, the newspaper headlines, because the folks that were the most opposed to it were newspaper organizations. The newspaper headlines were, and I remember my local paper said, Nava wants secret meetings. And so the knee-jerk reaction was, if you want to change Bagley-Keene, it's because you have something to hide. I haven't seen those kinds of headlines. We had the suspension of the rule by the governor's order. And we had a piece of legislation that was introduced that extended it to the end of January. The idea being that when the legislature comes back in January, perhaps they'll introduce urgency legislation that would take place immediately. And I think our study is going to be helpful in nudging people in that direction. But I think that the boards and commissions are going to express, or have been expressing to their elected officials, we like this. We think it's helpful. It saves us money. It gets more people involved in the process. There are some tweaks that probably ought to be done and can be done through a legislative process to evaluate implementation. But I think that people have experienced, their experiences have been so positive that they're going to ask their representatives to make sure something happens. I don't think people want to go back to how Bagley-Keene was before. And I think if you are a member of communities that has been discouraged from participating because of cost and time, your representative is going to be hearing from you, and you're going to want to make some changes to Bagley-Keene.
Actually, I saw recent articles in the last day or two where business leaders are saying, if you think we're going to go back to 8 to 5, 5 days a week in the office, you're wrong. We've changed. The second thing I've noticed, you see the newspapers were opposed to this early on. Things have changed financially for newspapers, and it's also an expense for them getting from point A to point B and getting to all these different meetings, and they have to cover more meetings with fewer people. The only way they can do that, I would think, is through these virtual meetings where they can pop on to a Zoom meeting and go from meeting to meeting to meeting, as opposed to trying to run from this building to that building. And they can do more with fewer people. Yep. The last thing I'd mention is, I do a lot of work as a federal arbitrator, and I'm on a panel that handles border patrol cases in Texas, New Mexico, and California. And so, before the pandemic, you had to fly to Texas, spend a day flying out there, have the hearing for a day, then fly back. It takes up a lot of time. Since the pandemic, all of the hearings have been virtual. And I'm telling you, it saves a lot of money. It saves a lot of time. And I think the parties initially were like, well, can you as the judge really understand the witnesses or the testimony if you do it virtually? And I find no difference whatsoever in doing it in person versus doing it virtually. And I think more people in these kinds of settings, boards, commissions, hearings, courts, are going to be using virtual meetings to save time and money. So it makes government more efficient.
Yeah, well, we believe that's true. And I think, look, in court settings, you're going to have to deal with the whole issue of the accused being able to confront their witness, and is a video exchange actual confrontation. But those are separate, distinct, and fairly limited kinds of issues to deal with. The larger conversation about boards and commissions that are doing everyday governing conversations doesn't have that same level, I think, of what is such an acute requirement for the protection of constitutional rights.
Well, let me throw another thing at you. What about the issue of safety? I mean, you've seen at school board meetings, people get very excited, and there is these threats of violence that could occur. And I'm thinking, maybe I was thinking more of the employment setup when someone's been terminated and they're fighting their termination, they get upset and they end up bringing a gun to a hearing, kind of thing. It's safer to do it virtually.
Yeah, and I think that there is and I don't know how long it's going to take us to get out from under the environment where the extremes are so extreme. But the notion that, particularly on school boards, that common everyday citizens who serve on school boards and who for the most part do it because they really care about children and education and furthering what's good in society, are confronted with threats to their physical safeties. Some of them receive death threats. Once their addresses have been disclosed, then they have to worry about what happens at their home. But certainly for public meetings, we've seen over and over and over again the kind of behavior that would make most parents cringe, right? I wasn't raised to behave that way. Most people aren't. And I do think that the tone is vicious, and it's designed to intimidate and to instill fear in people who are trying to the best of their ability to provide public service. So I could see how in certain situations, a remote meeting would still satisfy the right of the public to be advised as to what was being discussed, how it was being discussed, and also for their ability to participate. I don't know that a school board representative has to have someone 6 or 8 feet away from them expressing their opinion in order for that opinion to be heard, and for it to be acted on, assuming that it is reasonable.
But I'm wondering, was that brought up at all in your meetings, in any of the testimony?
It did, it didn't come up. I think when we did this report, it wasn't as vociferous as it is now. I think, the last 6 months or so we have seen an increase in these rather I call it violent exchanges at public meetings. So no, it did not come up when we were doing our report.
So what's your best guess? The legislature is going to modify the open meeting laws to allow for this, and what are going to be the parameters to make sure that there's always these unintended consequences when we do things? Any thoughts along those lines?
Well, that's why I think that one of the benefits of having it go through a legislative process is that whatever committees have the responsibility of crafting the legislation will take testimony from the public, both from those who realize and consider this to have many benefits, and those that are concerned that we're going away from and losing the ability for the public to actually see, hear, and participate. So there will be, I'm sure, compromises in terms of, so for example, what do you do if you have a remote meeting and there's an interruption in internet service? In all likelihood, you should probably conclude the meeting. If the whole idea is that you want to make sure that the public can hear and see the discussion about the issue at a public meeting, well, if the internet service goes down, then I think you really ought to conclude the meeting and then reconvene at another time. Give notice, right, as we normally do. Say, I'm sorry, but we had technical problems, but you should not, I don't believe you ought to proceed with a meeting if the public is thereafter prohibited because of technical.
Well, that really underscores too the whole importance of increasing internet service to outlying communities, right? They have to be able to access, or then there's even that gap, just like you see the educational gap when they're using distance technology, or telemedicine. If you don't have access to internet, it just makes the internet so much more important. The good news is that there's a lot of money, federal and state dollars, flowing to that problem to try to correct that problem.
There is now, and you're right. And we also, Little Hoover did a report on internet access some time ago, and compared to other countries, we don't do so well, and quite frankly, it is because there's a lack of competition. And we found that if you live in California, you are paying more for slower internet speeds than people even in other states.
We actually did a program with you on that, and the people can find it on the Maddy Institute website. And you're absolutely right. It's actually amazing how much more expensive it is in the United States versus other countries around the world. And there's some communities that are kind of creating their own internet service for their providers to create some kind of competition among internet providers, so it drives the cost down and the quality up.
Yep, Chattanooga is an example. So in Chattanooga, I had a family member who was living there for a while, and so we went over to visit, and he was showing me his internet speed, and he was like downloading 1,000 megabits, and his cost was around $70 a month. Now, you don't get 1,000 megabits for $70 a month in California. I mean, I don't even know where you get that, but the cost, Californians pay more for internet service, for slower internet service, than some of the other states in the United States of America. And there are many other foreign countries that routinely have higher broadband internet speeds than we do. And don't tell me it doesn't make a difference when we are trying to compete on the world stage with everybody, and we don't have a quality high-speed internet at a reasonable price. It makes us less competitive.
The internet service, not just for online democracy, but for, like I said, for telemedicine, for telework, which is very important to the Valley. People like in Bakersfield, telecommuting to Los Angeles, or in the North Valley, commuting to the Bay Area. Incredibly important for economic development and closing the economic gap between coastal California and inland California. Right. I see Felina Sutton has a question. Felina, go ahead and ask a question.
Thank you so much, Mark. Just as a physical room has a capacity limit, I think we've definitely hit some capacity limits in trying to work virtually to be in hearings in Sacramento. I apologize that I haven't read your report, but does your report address that type of capacity so that literally every voice could be heard?
Well, not directly, but I do think that since we've talked about the role of the legislature and whether or not they're going to extend the Bagley-Keene reforms, that has to be one of the things that is included in the Bagley-Keene reform. And I'll give you an example. It's an unpleasant one, but I think many of us saw the news item. It was just a few days ago, where there was a private company that had like a Zoom style meeting, where at the end of it, the CEO said, "If you're on this call, you're fired." And there were 900 people that were terminated at the end of the Zoom call. So obviously, if they were able to get 900 people on a Zoom call, the state of California ought to be able to do it as well. And that's a great point that you raise, and it needs to be something that we keep in mind, because we can't allow artificial barriers such as the inability to have enough access so that you get 900 people on a call. The state of California ought to be able to do that. Now, you might not ever need 900, but you still should have the capacity to make sure that if the public wants to log in, that they can.
Let me be a contrarian here, Pedro. So you get 900 people on the call and everyone wants to make a comment. You'll be there for 2 days listening to comments, or 3 days. How do you control that? If this works too well and everybody wants to have their say, how do you do it in a fair way?
Well, you do know that Bagley-Keene allows a board or commission to establish a specific amount of time for public comment. So, for example, the Little Hoover Commission can set at the beginning of the meeting 20 minutes or 30 minutes for public comment. So I think that's how you manage that. And you have to be sensitive to, obviously, how controversial the issue is. If you're dealing with something that nobody's really fighting about, then you're probably going to get by. And how many times have you had public comment and there wasn't anybody who wanted anything to say?
Right.
So I think it balances it out.
I'm just worried about, you're saving the time from not flying from Santa Barbara to Sacramento, but then you're going to spend, 5 times the amount of time at a hearing listening to all these people who have all these comments. Great for democracy. I mean, one of the things also that's kind of interesting as a side note, we haven't changed the size of the California legislature in 130 years, 140 years, when we were a much, much, much smaller state. In the 1800s, we still have 120 people in the California legislature. And it was just, is the size, should we expand the California legislature so people can really have some say, know who their legislator is, their assembly member or state senator, and actually be able to contact them? Because now it's almost unwieldy, the number of people they have to represent.
Well, yeah, as an assembly representative, my district had around 450,000 people. And I think if you're a state senator, you have just about double that. You have 900,000 to 1 million. One of the advantages of technology, and I think one of the benefits of technology, is that you can apply it in such a way that you can do more outreach. So think about this. If you are Senator McGuire, right? Your Senate district runs from the Oregon border almost down to Bakersfield. And it is an incredibly huge district. And I have a friend who was working in that office and would talk about the schedule that he had on weekends. You spend almost all of your time driving from one place to the other, in your car. My district in Santa Barbara was from Los Alamos in the north to Oxnard in the south. And if you want to spend time meeting with your people and actually doing it in public, that's harder to do than if you apply technology.
Right.
But yeah, are they this new building that they're adding, right? They're going to tear down the annex and construct a new part of the Capitol, I'm wondering if that's going to be big enough to accommodate additional members. I kind of doubt it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm actually a fan of the Nebraska's unicameral situation. I think you have 120 legislators. I don't understand the point of, and maybe someone can explain this to me, why we have a Senate based on population and an Assembly based on population. It's not like the US, the federal situation where there are 2 senators from every state regardless of population. In California, both are based on population. It seems to me if they're all based on population, why not just have 120 in one legislative body?
Well, because what would you do with the green and the red carpet?
Oh, there you go. There you go.
I mean, there's some things that you just can't, it's tradition. There's some things you can't walk away from.
Well, maybe now is the time to do it because they are tearing down, part of the building and then they're rebuilding. So maybe now's the time to think about that.
Based on what I saw and the kind of competition that can arise between members of the Assembly and the Senate, I don't think so.
Yeah. Well, if we could tell all the Assembly members you're now going to become senators, maybe
right.
that will be appealing to them.
Yeah. Well, someone else is going to have to sell it.
Right. So does anyone else have any questions here? I've got a few people online, but I haven't seen other questions. And okay, Alex, go ahead, ask a question.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be recognized. Mr. Keppler actually mentioned some of my points earlier, talking about safety in an online setting, especially given the current climate and the contentiousness of certain issues. I was hoping if you could elaborate a little bit more, Mr. Nava, about government and boards in general who host online meetings, maybe falling behind in certain tech areas, such as having cybersecurity and the ability to verify people's identity if they're providing either witness testimony or representing an interest group, perhaps. Because it's not just school boards who are subject to Bagley-Keene and Brown Act. It's also student groups such as student governments and California community colleges and universities.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, if we're doing a meeting like this, you can look at me and sort of figure out, okay, that looks like Pedro. The only times that it would be questionable is if you have someone who does a call in and there is no video, so you can't confirm that that is the person, or they don't have their camera up. So I think if they're going to make changes to Bagley-Keene, some of the issues you raise with respect to security and identity are going to have to be discussed. So, I mean, what is it that you do, and how do you ensure that if someone says that they're Pedro Nava, but there's no camera, that's really Pedro Nava? And I suppose one of the ways to do that is in the event that someone were to impersonate someone else, that there could be a penalty for that. We don't always necessarily think that people are going to be on their best behavior. I learned when I was a prosecutor, and I have this saying that everybody behaves differently when there are witnesses. And so for some instances, you're going to have to suggest or impose penalty for those who attempt to misrepresent who they are because of how it damages credibility in the process. And that's an important value that we have to protect. Now, things work for the most part because we have a shared sense of how they're supposed to work. They don't necessarily function out of fear or apprehension, but there are some people who don't share that value. And I think that one of the ways in order to discourage people from doing that is emphasize that it corrupts the process, that it creates less trust in the integrity of the process. And if they do it, there should be provisions, I think, to bring about punishment.
Let me ask you this, Pedro.
Or criminal.
Alex brings up a really interesting point about cybersecurity. When you were sitting on the Assembly, or for that matter, sitting on the Commission now, does a weight of testimony influence your judgment, or do you think it would influence other people's judgment, whether it be a politician or whatever? And that leads to the point that if some of these folks, people are coming out outside sources, people who don't live in the state or don't even live in the country, are then giving their comments and you're thinking it's coming from a constituent, it really isn't. Would that corrupt the process? Or are decision makers or politicians kind of know where they're going, and public testimony, they listen to it, but they're kind of have their mind made up?
Yeah, I think there's a balance. I mean, if you are dealing with experts, and that likelihood that you're going to see the expert and they're going to be testifying, and so you can evaluate their credibility and how deeply they have done the work to support their opinions. As it relates to public comment, I just don't think that policymakers are influenced by the sheer number or volume of commenters. I mean, I quite frankly have never set up a grid where I go, okay, I had 201 people to say no on something and I had 70 say yes, and so I'm going to go on the no side. I think as an elected representative, part of what I understood my responsibility was to bring to the decision making that which I told my constituents I would, that it would be objective, that it would be fair, I would be attempting to try to do the most good for the most people. And electeds tend to, I think, they get elected because of campaign representations. And then if they demonstrate that, in fact, they actually hold those beliefs. So, yeah, I mean, it is a difficult question. I don't think it means that we should shy away from remote meetings. I just think we have to work as hard as we can to come up with means by which to limit the harm that comes about from those who deliberately want to corrupt the process.
Yeah.
I appreciate your points there, sir. And I've looked through some of the report and I agree that we need to preserve the importance of these laws such as Bagley-Keenan Brown Act while also improving meeting capacity. However, I was just wondering if the study considered phenomena such as astroturfing, like having people paid to go attend a city council meeting, for example, and represent one side. And how do you verify and confirm who's actually truly a constituent, and so we can preserve representation in these meetings?
No, and those are good questions. And quite frankly, the turfing that you speak of, that happens all the time in in-person meetings. It is not unusual for a particular employer, for example, who is attempting, because I sat on the Coastal Commission for 8 years as well. So it's not unusual for a property owner or an employer to bring in 20, 30, 40, 50 people all wearing the same t-shirt that says, I support my boss's decision.
Pedro, I even have a better example than that. There was a bar along a trail corridor we have here in Fresno Clovis who wanted to extend his patio onto the trail. He ended up getting a bunch of patrons, free drinks, whatever, got them drunk at his place, put them on a bus, brought them down to city council to testify on his behalf. And then it was exposed, so it didn't really help his cause. We have another question. I don't have the name. Someone has their hand raised. I don't have a name here, so whoever has their hand raised, go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, it looks like a phone caller. There you go.
Yes, thank you. My name is Doug Muirhead. I live in Morgan Hill in the county of Santa Clara. Thank you for this conversation. I would like to just touch on the example that Chair Nava gave about the physical presence, the ability to pat on the shoulder. I used to go to board meetings, commission meetings, city councils, and the advantage is that I could have a side conversation with an elected official or with their staff or with other members of the public who either shared my interests or opposed me, and I was trying to figure out what was going on. So I have lost all that in the last year and a half. And to make matters worse, many senior staff members are departing and new people are coming in. They don't know me, I don't know them. So there's, I guess I'd have to say, public meetings turned out to be my social network. So I just wanted to say there are some real advantages to these physical meetings. the mayor of Gilroy is currently holding in-person Saturday coffee meetings, and it's just a delight to go sit in a room with other people and listen to the back and forth. So I miss that, and I would like to get it back. And all of the things, all the reasons you've given for the remote meetings, I agree with you. I learned a couple of things I hadn't thought about in those advantages. So thank you for this conversation.
Thank you. Pedro, want to comment?
Well, yeah, I really appreciate what he said. I can tell you on the Little Hoover Commission, we have commissioners that have said, when are we coming back for our physical meetings? Because they miss being able to sit with their colleagues. And I think what we have to keep in mind as we discuss these meetings in remote is that we're certainly not saying that public meetings should be discontinued or discouraged. All we are saying is that Bagley-Keene should be reformed in such a way so that commissioners and board members can, on occasion, participate remotely without having to disclose their location. It's like I said, I have a virtual background. It's the Capitol. I really like it. It's pretty. But if I were to take that down, you'd see my little dog sitting on the bed and my pillows. And that's not necessarily terribly professional and wouldn't likely elevate the conversation. So I will tell you a story one time that someone later told me I would get in trouble for having done it. And it is, I had to stay in Santa Barbara. We had a Little Hoover Commission meeting. I gave the address of the location where I would be. Well, it turned out it was a public parking structure, and I had parked on the very top level out in the open, and I was doing the meeting on the phone through my car. And my thought was, if anybody wants to pull up next to my car, I can satisfy Bagley-Keene sitting in my car on the top of this parking structure. Now, I was told that wasn't sufficient. That would not satisfy Bagley-Keene, so I didn't get to do that. And there was one time then that I actually made arrangements to use a law office conference room. But no, we're not saying do away with public meetings and do away with Bagley-Keene. We're just saying that there should be some flexibility to allow participation by commissioners and others without necessarily having to disclose your physical location because it doesn't always work.
There's a practical thing that the caller has also mentioned. I know, for example, in the cases that I hear, one of the things that made it easier to go to virtual was I had done in-person hearings with these attorneys before. They knew me, I knew them, and so they felt comfortable. I'm not sure, his point being, I'm not sure that if that had been new attorneys that I had never worked with before, if they would have been comfortable going straight to a virtual meeting. They want to know the person a little bit. The hearing officer, know the commissioner, whoever. So I think that's a valid point. Yeah,
and the point that he said, it's like staff is changing. So he has been able to form relationships with staff, and let's be frank. In most instances, staff does all the work. The commissioners get to show up and get the credit, but it's the staff who actually puts pen to paper and makes things happen. Pen to paper. Now I'm dating myself, but he's right. When you've had the opportunity to form relationships with both electeds or board members and staff, there's a level of comfort and trust that you're not going to be able to develop the same way on Zoom during a meeting. And that's why, again, we say we're not saying do away with public meetings. We think they're valuable. We have commissioners who want to get back to public meetings as soon as they can. But there may be times, we think, where remote meetings that we've been going through for the last year can be very helpful, that can increase public participation and include people who normally don't participate.
One of the things that people, a lot of taxpayers are sometimes concerned about the efficiency and effectiveness of government, and they complain about fraud, waste, and abuse. And I think they fail to recognize that there are some very powerful agencies that are doing that job, and the Little Hoover Commission is one of them. So Pedro, as we end up here, I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about maybe some of the future research topics that you're going to be looking into, or maybe some of the things you've done that the folks may want to take a look at. And I also would encourage folks to take a look at the Little Hoover Commission website. You don't have to read the full report. They have very good executive summaries that can summarize things for you, but that's, yes.
That working? Never mind.
LHC.gov. So Pedro, I'll let you end up with some comments, some final comments.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we talked about, we've discussed before, and it's one that I think is really, really important, is how we as a state deal with children's mental health, particularly those kids that have been, shut off from their peers for a year. They're going to go back to school. As schools open, they're going back to school. And whether we like it or not, they have suffered tremendously by not being with their classmates, by not engaging socially, by being isolated, by spending more time with their parents than they ever wanted to. And we have to be sensitive and conscious of when they act out in school, because they will. How do we respond to that? How do we treat them? One of the witnesses at our hearing on children's mental health had a saying that I just thought was really profound. And that was, when kids act up, instead of saying what's wrong with you, we need to say what happened to you. That completely changes the orientation. We need to be sensitive to the fact that these are kids, and they're kids that are coming back to school, that are angry, they're upset, they're confused. So if we're going to discipline them because we need to have order in the classrooms, then we better rethink about what we do and how we do it. And there are some school districts that recognize this and have counselors, so that the first pass is a conversation with a counselor. It's not being sent to the principal's office. It's not being expelled. That's one that I think we got to pay attention to. The other study that Little Hoover did that I think is important has to do with peace officer standards and training. POST is the entity in California that establishes the criteria for training for police officers. Now, I'm a former legislator, and I know how exciting the new bright, shiny thing can be. And too often we have legislators who write bills that are based on headlines and ask POST to have peace officers be trained in new and different things. And so we end up with a huge stack of training requirements. And I will tell you a little secret: they've never been evaluated for how effective they are. None of them. The courses that officers are asked to go through in order to become a peace officer have never been evaluated on an objective, rational basis to decide if it works. Does it make them better cops? Does it help them understand their jobs better? We have no idea. So we are saying that stop it. Let's have a timeout on legislation for more training. Let's spend the money to evaluate the training that they have. And one of the things that we learned, and I don't know if anybody has ever done it, an anonymous survey provided to peace officers throughout the state of California, and thank you to the agencies for their help. 700 agencies in California, 87,000 peace officers in California. And one of the things that they came back and told us, for training, they want to know how to de-escalate situations. They want to be given the skills where they can help things calm down. We ask a lot of our peace officers. We want them to be social workers. We want them to be progressive in their approach and conversations with people out in the street. We want them to lock up bad guys. We want them to make us safe. It's a little too much. It's a little unfair. So let's evaluate what we're asking them to do so that they can do what they're best at. And then let's figure out who else should be helping law enforcement to help keep our communities safe.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Nava. I know I refer to you as Pedro. I hope that's okay. You're so approachable. I feel like, I know you. So I apologize if that was not appropriate on my part.
No, right. Just don't call me late for dinner.
Okay. Well, I want to thank Commissioner Pedro Nava with the Little Hoover Commission for joining us today. A wide-ranging discussion, all the kinds of topics and research that they are involved with. I encourage you to take a look at the Little Hoover Commission website and read at least the executive summaries of their reports. A lot of valuable information there. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Happy holidays and Merry Christmas to everyone. And we will see you in the new year. Take care.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.